So you got all these people who may be around you that do things for you, but you just can't stand them, right? The only reason they were in your house was to do all the work, and one day they simply said, "Hey, I'm leaving." How'd that make you feel? Couldn't stand them, but at the same time, you can't see them. You couldn't afford to let them go. Well, this quarter we're discussing Moses, of course, and his actions as a youngster in Egypt, his flight to Midian, and today's lesson finishes the story of his return and the plagues that were placed on Egypt. And all of this is God's plan to deliver his people, the Jews, from captivity and their servitude in Egypt. Now, God, through Moses, produced some unbelievable harms on the Israelites, on the residents of Egypt. And all of those harms were designed to show Pharaoh of God's power and might, and how, in comparison, he was ineffective and incapable. And even the gods of Egypt could not match him. Last week we discussed the first of 10 plagues that he caused in Egypt at the hands of Moses. And so today we're going to finish that story. Now, I find it intriguing that the plagues are reported in Exodus, and by the time of the psalmists, not all of them were recorded. And I don't know how David and the others could have decided which ones to talk about and which ones to leave out. They all were important to the story. Today's lesson begins with the plague of boils. Now, as a dirty little kid growing up in South Arkansas in the dirt of the Delta down there, playing in the sloughs of the heart of Arkansas and crawling around in the black dirt of the Delta, I used to get boils. Primarily, they were on my knees for some reason. I guess it's because all my jeans had holes in the knees, right? But at any rate, and occasionally on my posterior, and occasionally back there. And any of you suffer from boils as a youngster? Have you ever had a boil? Have you ever had a pimple? Think about a pimple on steroids. That is a boil. I mean, those things can get huge and they can hurt like the dickens. They're painful. But what happened to the Israelites, what happened to the Egyptians is an example of just how powerful God is. This plague, the boils, was a plague, a direct attack on the goddess Isis, who was the wife of Osiris, who gave birth to the god Horus. Now, her specialty was the gift of medicine and healing arts. But even with boils appearing on all of the people of Egypt, and even in Pharaoh's household, the prayers that they offered to Isis for help and support in that time were not answered. And even through all of that, they held fast, and Pharaoh would not release the Israelite workforce. God commanded Moses to take soot from a furnace and told Moses to toss it in the air, and festering boils broke out over all the Egyptians. Now, the magicians could not even stand to attempt a replay, probably because they were hurting too bad from the boils. And it wasn't just one boil or two boils. It was a lot of boils on every person. So you can just imagine how painful that would have been. Pharaoh's heart, though, was hardened even after all of that. The next plague is a plague of hail. We know hail, right? This attack was an attack on the goddess of the air. Her name is Nut, N-U-T. She is often shown as a very tall and very skinny woman. You can see her outline there, how tall and skinny she would have been, because she was supposedly covering the entire earth. Now, they also thought the earth was flat at the time, and so that's why she only goes from here to here, because it covered the earth. Being the night sky, she's often shown with stars all over her body, and often she's even colored dark blue, and the stars are yellow. She is the protector of her husband, the god Ra, the sun god. Now, this was weird, but at night, she supposedly swallows Ra, and then she brings him forth in the morning. She would be the one to pray to if the crops were failing for lack of water, or the Nile had flooded and was threatening their homes. She would be the one they would pray to when the tremendous hailstorm began. And with this plague, God commanded Moses to tell Pharaoh that his patience was wearing thin. By now, I could have wiped you off the face of the earth, but you have been raised up for this very purpose, to declare how I am mighty and I am strong, so that my name will be proclaimed in all of the earth." Moses then told Pharaoh to see to it that all the livestock and all the people be brought into a place of shelter at this time tomorrow. Any man or any beast that's left outside is going to be killed by hail. So they were given in advance an opportunity to know what to do to get ready for it. And the next day, those who feared had brought their slaves and their livestock in. Other Egyptians did not. When Moses stretched his staff to the sky, hail began falling, and the sky was filled with lightning, and it was undoubtedly the worst hailstorm in Egypt's history. Hail destroyed their crops, their plants, their trees, and any unfortunate animals who were left outside, just as Moses said, and many Egyptian people. Now here's an example on the right there of a hailstorm that was recent, and these hailstorms aren't that big, but yet you see the dead sheep that are up there. It just so happened that they got caught in a very bad hailstorm, and it does happen even today. It did happen back then to everything in Egypt, except for, of course, the Israelites. Pharaoh's heart began to melt just a little bit. And he came back to Moses, and the first time that he said it, but he said, "I have sinned. The Lord is right, we were wrong." As the hail fell, he felt responsible. He could see the devastation from his palace. So he called for Moses. He agreed to let the Israelites go. But when Moses called a halt to the hail, Pharaoh hardened his heart again. He changed his mind. He wouldn't let the Israelites leave. Do you think Moses expected that? Do you think Moses was ready for the next one, the next thing that God's going to do? Or do you think Moses felt like this would surely do it? What do you think? Well, whatever you think, it happened. Imagine the devastation of the Egyptians' crops after the hail. This plague was a hail of locusts, if you will. The next plague, though, helped clean up a little bit of some of the devastation of the one just before it. Huge swarms of locusts came in and began eating everything they could munch on. Now, those crops were laying in the field. The locusts came in and cleared the fields out for the people. This plague was against the Egyptian god of chaos. His name is Set. He was the god of the red soil, or the sand, and he had a brother whose name was Osiris, and Osiris was the god of the black soil, the soil you'd plant in. The two gods hated each other, and Set eventually usurped his brother Osiris, and the two were constantly at war. Set finally killed his brother Osiris, cut him up into numerous pieces. And Osiris' wife, though, Isis, remember we talked about her earlier, she was able to put him back together and restored his life. Now, the eighth plague was a plague of locusts. By this time, Pharaoh's leaders had had enough. They said, I can't imagine anything worse that's going to happen to us. This has got to be it. We've had enough. So they went to Pharaoh. They begged him to let the people go, and at least let them go and worship their God just as they want to. But Pharaoh's staff was ready for this nightmare to be over. No matter what they did, no matter their prayers to their gods, they were all suffering at the hands of the Israelites. Enough is enough, they said. They shouted in unison to the leader Pharaoh. So Pharaoh began, at this point, to bargain with Moses. Moses demanded that all men and children and women would need to go along with him out with their flocks out to the wilderness to worship their God. And Pharaoh said, "Well, I'll let your men go, and I'll let you take your boys with you, but your women must remain here." See, he wanted something to make sure that if the guys did go out there and worship, that they would come back to get their spouses and their children. Moses, though, would not bargain with Pharaoh. God told Moses to say to Pharaoh that because he was not willing to humble himself before God, tomorrow God is going to bring these locusts in to devastate your crops. In fact, this will be the biggest swarm ever recorded. And when they leave, every tree, every plant, every vine will be devastated. I teach another lesson on a class in the New Testament talking about locusts, and I show some pictures of devastation after locusts have moved into an area, and it's amazing what they'll do. They take a tree and strip all of the bark off of it. Then they strip all of the next layer off of it. Then they strip everything down to where you have nothing but sticks. When it's finished, it looks like a bomb went off, and these trees, obviously they can't live after that, and they die. It's amazing. Well, by this time, the staff got enough composure to eventually go before Pharaoh, but this time they demand that he allow the Israelites to leave to worship their God. You've seen the devastation Moses is causing. Enough's enough. Let the people go. Now, this is the moment God knew would come, because earlier in chapter 6, he told Moses, the Egyptians will want you to leave. So this is the fulfillment of that promise that God made to Moses. But while the people wanted him to leave, did Pharaoh agree? What do you think? Well, Moses stretched his staff then, and the east wind blew in a massive squall of locusts. It was the largest infestation of locusts in Egypt's history. And the locusts devoured everything they could munch on, and all the plants of the field and trees and fruit, and everything was gone. All Egypt was bare of food. And again, after this, Pharaoh cried, I have sinned, and begged Moses to remove the locust infestation. And a stiff westerly wind blew in, and it pushed the locust swarm into the Red Sea. There are locust swarms that happen over there even today, not to the level of this. They still happen over there today, and thankfully the wind tends to push toward the sea and take them away when they do come. So this is not unusual, but God used that to blow all the locusts away. And when the swarms were gone, Pharaoh changed his mind yet again, and his heart was hardened one more time. What does the word penultimate mean? Penultimate. What do you think it means? Does it mean better than the best? It would be the number one of all number ones ever were. It's the penultimate, right? It's not the second, but it's the second from last. It's the penultimate in terms of last place. And it comes from the world of the ancient track and field. And this leads us to the penultimate plague, which of course is darkness. This is the next to the last plague. Darkness, as dark as you've ever seen, although you can't see dark, can you? Really? Hadn't thought about that. Darkness, as dark as you can imagine, came upon them even before the night did. This would have been an attack on their sun god, Ra, probably one of the more significant gods in their whole mythology. His symbol is a man with an eagle's head and with a sun disk up there on top of his head. He is the creator, supposedly, of all life, including man. And so God saved the best for last. If you don't think I can take care of all these lesser gods, what's going to happen when we come to the very last God you have, the God that you place the most importance? He's the one that created all life, and this attacked that God. It was the second in a set of three that were an attack on Ra. Actually, there had been others. The plague of 8 had locusts that blotted out the midday sun, and that would have been kind of an attack on Ra. Plague 9 is going to bring darkness into Egypt, but not Goshen. And then plague 10, we're going to have the firstborn children die. When did they die? What time of night? Was it 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock? It was midnight. Midnight would have been the time that their God was furthest away from them, because after midnight he starts coming close back to them again. So in effect, all three of these had an impact on that greatest of the Egyptian gods. In Exodus chapter 10, Pharaoh told Moses to get out of my sight. The next time I see you, I'm going to shoot you. Moses said, as you wish, you will not see me again. And then in chapter 10, it says, Moses came back and warned Pharaoh, and he doesn't die. If you read that, it's a little confusing there, because between chapter 10 and 11, it's really unfortunate that there's a chapter break there. Because if you read that and don't finish the story in chapter 10, it goes on to explain a little bit more in chapter 11. He does leave this meeting, though, and he never again meets with the Egyptian leader after the 10th plague. God promises the final plague, and it's a particularly hard one, right? He will go throughout Egypt, and any of the firstborn sons are going to die. Any firstborn sons in all of Egypt, including the Israelites, if they're not careful. In Egypt, there would be loud wailing. It would be perfect quiet, though, in Goshen, because none of the Israelites' children were taken that night. God told Moses what's going to happen, and as Moses tells the story, it happens exactly as God said. In the Israelite quarters, everyone was busy. Passover lambs were being slain. Everybody's house's entrance was being painted red with blood on 3 sides, on the left side, the doorpost at the top, and the one on the right side. And the Israelites then retired into their homes, and they waited for an angel of the Lord to come and pass by, and that's why it's called Passover today. Incidentally, I've often heard, I read the story and realized that God told Moses to take hyssop, Hyssop, and I've seen that in the Bible on a few times. Do you know what hyssop is? Hyssop is lavender. It's lavender. Take a lavender pod, take it up there, and use it as a paintbrush. Now that's interesting, isn't it? I've never known what hyssop was, and I've heard it before. Well, what does Passover mean to the Jews today? It's a much anticipated holiday, right? As probably the most important holiday in the Jewish calendar, and it celebrated, of course, the first victory over being enslaved by another country. Has that happened to Israel over the time since then? Of course. And I would say many people think even today they're being enslaved by other countries. The meal that they have on this day is known as a Seder, S-E-D-E-R. And it's the Passover meal. It's a very important meal, and all of it is described in detail in the book of Exodus. Have any of you had friends who were Jews who invited you to come to their house in Passover? I had a friend, his name was Ken Applebaum, and knowing him, I don't think I would have gone to Ken's house to eat. But nonetheless, I really would have enjoyed the opportunity to sit with the Jewish family and have a Passover. And it's routine for them to have friends come and eat Passover with them. So if you have any Jewish friends, you can ask that. Did you have? Pardon?
Like that all the and does all the food and all that.
Oh, okay. Prepare a Passover and do that, just so you can see what it was like. Yeah, cool. Well, the 15th and 16th of their month of Nisan, which occurs on different days in April. Every year it's a different time because you got to get a week there. And it's the most important celebration, a yearly ceremonial presentation in the form of a family meal with 6, and in some families possibly 7 different things that you eat, ingredients. And these ingredients have specific meanings to the Jews that come from different events in their history. And the day of the year also has specific special significance, and it commemorates the meal that each family ate in the household of the Jews in Egypt before they left. God gave a very specific list of ingredients for Moses for them to eat on this very first Passover while they were in Egypt. Also, there are 4 glasses of wine that are served along with this meal, so it's going to be a fun meal if you ever do get to go eat with them. But we'll talk more about what those 4 glasses of wine represent later when we come to the New Testament, and we're talking about some promises God made about a prophet that's going to come back. So we won't talk about that, but we will talk about all of these elements that go into this Seder meal. What happens is a platter is prepared with all of the stuff that's on it set out on the table, and then people pick from it as they go around, make sure they get a piece of everything when they go through the meal. And this is sort of what the Seder plate may look like. It doesn't have to be on a wooden platter. It doesn't have to be in wooden bowls. It can be any kind of platters and bowls, whatever they have. Usually the best place settings that they have are preserved for this day and brought out. So they use very exquisite bowls and everything else when they can. The first thing that I show here is a centerpiece. Now, this is a very recent addition. This is not traditional. If you were going to a traditional Jewish family for Passover, there would be no centerpiece in there. But Jews today seem to want to bring things in that also remind them of things that occurred in their history since the Passover, right? An orange is brought in sometimes to represent the struggle of gay people in Jewish communities. Olives, if they're there, represent the opposition of Jews and the Palestinians. And we know that there's been tremendous opposition of those folks for a long time. And a banana, of all things, would represent all the Syrian refugees. Remember the Syrian refugee crisis that happened? We remember that. The Syrian refugees that fled. It's not an ingredient, though, in the Bible. Most of the Seder tables do not include this item. This was pulled principally from other books that they have that really are not, don't align with the Bible. The second ingredient then is a roasted shank bone of a lamb. It's called a zeroah. That bone is scraped of meat and fat. It's just a bone. And then that bone is roasted, and it sits as a remembrance for them of the very first Passover, the very night the Jews left Egypt. Some families use a shank bone of a lamb, but some families use a chicken leg bone, and others may use chicken wing. At its core, it represents the innocent lambs that were sacrificed in the temple, known as the Pesach lamb. So there's always a bone sitting out there with all those nice foods that you're going to eat. The third thing that's there is parsley. In their parlance, they would call it harpus. It's a spring vegetable, and of course, it celebrates the awesomeness and reminds them of how awesome spring is. The fourth is what they call maror. Maror. When they got to the first place they came to after 3 days' journey, and they stopped and camped there, it was called Mara. Remember that? That's a play on this very same word here because they had bitter water at Mara that day. So this is Mara to them. Mara in their language simply means bitter. There are two bitter ingredients at the Seder table. The first ingredient is, we'll talk about here, and the fourth ingredient comes later. So there are two Maras there. It's a symbol of the bitterness that they had when they were slaves in Egypt, and also the harshness of the life that they're even facing today. Then there is, I don't know how to pronounce this, I'll give you my best shot at it, just haroset or charoset. And it's the only element of the Seder plate that's not mentioned in the Torah. It is from the Talmud where the link between charoset and mortar is made. So really when they eat this charoset, it's to remind them that they used to have to build, create mortar to keep these bricks that they had made together. Now when you eat the horseradish, you eat some of this charoset with it because you couldn't stand to eat a whole mouthful of horseradish if you didn't have something sweet to help you be able to take that in. So when you eat the bitterness of the Mara, then you would grab a bite of the horseradish and perhaps have the two together. The hard-boiled egg is there, and it's a single egg that sits on the table, and all of them get a piece of that egg. In some Jewish families, the hard-boiled egg is often also slightly roasted. In this state, it's a food that is a food of mourning. And I'm not talking about daytime, nighttime mourning. I'm talking about mourning as in crying. An egg there would represent mourning that the Jews went through. And then the seventh ingredient that's listed there would be romaine lettuce or some kind of lettuce that would be a bit, but they eat it because it's supposed to not taste too good. We'll put it that way, right? And so the romaine is a common thing that they do as a mara. The lettuce is to remind the Jews of their period of enslavement and how bitter their life really was at the time. I would love, again, to go and have a Passover feast. If you have children, it might be a good thing to do as your parents did, certainly to help them understand what was going on. Okay. It was yeah. Yeah, the dinner would be kind of light that night, wouldn't it? Did anybody try to gnaw on that bone? You know? You actually ate lamb? Okay. Well, we know about the last plague, right? It's the death of the firstborn. At midnight, after the Jews had eaten their Passover meal, None of the Jews' children died, or if the only children that would have died, of course, would have been those that didn't put the blood up and didn't have this meal that was just prepared for them. The angel of the Lord appeared and struck down any household, the firstborn in any son, where the mark was not there. This would have happened in all the households, not just the Israelites. And any Jewish household that did not prepare for that night would suffer like the Egyptians did. You can imagine the horror. You can imagine the loud wailing that was going on in the entire city, can't you? It's almost too horrible to think about. I love this image here. This is Pharaoh sitting there very resolute, not shedding any tears. His wife beside him is leaning over their eldest child, who apparently died that night. Pharaoh got on his iPhone and he messaged Moses, "You can go now. Get out of town. The Egyptians are anxious for you to leave." In fact, God had told them, "Go knock on the doors of your Egyptian neighbors and ask politely for parting gifts, and they will give you those." And that's what they did. This begins the Exodus. Next week we'll pick up there with that. Any comments or any questions you might have? Good, because I don't know that I would have answers for you. Any comments you want to make?